I wanted to ask you a would you rather question. Are you up for that?
I guess.
Let's do it. So would you rather have a fire truck going by while you're presenting on Zoom or be Zoom bombed by a family member in the background?
How important is this presentation?
It's a weekly report meeting.
Got it. I would say family member because I think my family is like pretty attractive.
That's good.
Yeah.
They're not embarrassing though?
They're embarrassing, but you know.
Because, my mom yelling in the background, my brother cooking lunch. You never know what you're going to get at my house.
Yeah.
Have you ever had like a bad Zoom bomb experience?
Oh my God. So we had, I won't say what event it was. We had a live event and sort of participants were split off into breakout rooms for discussion.
Okay.
And I heard I thankfully was not there, but during this like small group discussion of like 3 people, a naked person walked like in the frame behind someone, like fully nude. And like, it's one of those things, I don't know what I would have done because I feel like I would have just laughed.
I totally would have,
like not appropriate at all. And at the same time, like, do you want to embarrass someone by being like, hey, Joe, there's a naked person in your camera? Like, I don't know how you handle that situation. Thankfully, the editor who did handle it was like a total pro. So I think she would like very calmly shut down the situation, which like I couldn't.
That is crazy. Like you hear crazy stories about people doing crazy things on Zoom, but I've never actually heard somebody experience that. And like you said, there's really only 2 things you can do. You can either ignore it, which is so hard, or you can embarrass the person. So there's no really easy way to navigate all this. So if anybody's listening to this and expecting some advice from us, I don't have all the answers, but we do have a guest on this episode that will definitely be able to help us out.
Hi, Dr. McCluney. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Yasmin. Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of what me and Christina were discussing and our questions for you, tell us broadly about your research and about your work.
Yes, so I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. And in that capacity, I'm mainly trying to understand how we can create more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. The specific approach I take is trying to understand seemingly innocuous and neutral practices inside of organizations that create unequal and equitable experiences for members of certain groups. One of those practices, for instance, is wanting everyone to appear professional at work. And that is quite a loaded term. What does it mean to appear and sound and be professional? And the various ways that that creates inequality for, in my work, I primarily say this with Black people in professional workplaces and entrepreneurial ecosystems, and even sometimes in religious settings. We have far-reaching schemas in our head about who looks like a leader, who sounds professional. So I try to unpack that in my research.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And I just wanted to know, how did you get into this field? Did you always think that you were going to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Not at all. I had a pre-med dream in undergrad. Realized that I actually did not like needles or the sight of blood, so quickly switched over to studying people and their social relationships and psychology. I was really enamored by the positive psychology movement that was happening around the mid-early 2000s. I took a class with Barbara Fredrickson at UNC Chapel Hill, who was studying like love and emotions and the various ways that our social settings create opportunities for connection. So fast forward into grad school at the University of Michigan, they have the Positive Organizational Scholarship Center at the Ross School of Business. And they were, again, trying to understand how organizations create thriving and authenticity. But one of the things I noticed, especially coming from the psychology department, was there was little discussion around how different groups can experience or express certain emotions in the workplace, or what it would actually take for them to thrive at work. So I tried to mirror the two conversations, where in psychology, we had a lot of scholars focusing on Black identity development and physiological consequences of experiencing race-related stress, in conversation with the positive organizational scholarship group. So bringing those together is, I have a firm belief that organizations can create good in the world and can help us present and be our best selves, but I don't think they know how to get there, particularly for a group of people who are already marginalized in so many ways. So that's sort of how I came into that work, heavily inspired by my parents as well. My dad was the first Black manager of his manufacturing plant in North Carolina, and just seeing how he experienced different forms of discrimination, what it was like to be upwardly mobile, Black family, moving into more white spaces throughout my upbringing, all of those kind of influenced the way that I approach this work today.
That makes a lot of sense. And you actually touched on a lot of things that we have been discussing in our last episode. As you said, you sort of primarily investigate the work experiences of people of color, and in an effort to kind of understand how they continue to be marginalized or devalued at work. And I'm curious, our office moved to remote work at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've been doing that since. What are some of the kind of biggest patterns that you've noticed in our new remote working environment?
A few things I've noticed at a large scale, and I'll keep the focus on the US for now, because I think there's certainly different things happening globally. We started to unpack this notion that we have broadband inequality and inequity in our society. Internet access has always been considered an individual endeavor, an individual luxury that people can afford. So when companies and schools started to send people home for health-related safety reasons, a new form of inequity emerged, where not everyone has access to a safe environment for them to do focused work, and that they don't have the equipment to maintain a online digital presence in the same way. And this tended to fall along lines of class, generational status, age, and race and gender in lots of ways. We also saw this pendulum swing around working hours, where a lot of people were reporting more working hours early in the pandemic, not quite sure when and how to disconnect from work when you are working from home or living at work in various ways. And then this pattern around how often people were working started to differ by parental status and gender, where a lot of working mothers reported less working hours during what's considered a normal work time, this 9 to 5, because they were also trying to help with childcare and elder care and other caregiver responsibilities that tends to disproportionately affect women and working mothers in particular. So we're seeing them report lots of work hours, but just at times where they probably should be sleeping or resting and recovering. The last thing I'll say in terms of patterns that emerged in this new remote work environment was figuring out which jobs cannot be performed at home and which ones can. So a lot of retail jobs, a lot of hospitality jobs, but then also high demands on workers who are now considered essential and not able to do remote grocery deliveries or remote healthcare, and them also working longer hours. So those are all the patterns that emerged so far in this time.
Yeah. And you mentioned the fact that remote work it's not everyone loves remote work. It's not really fair and equal for everybody along gender lines and race lines. But how do you think remote work has either helped or hindered employees of color?
That's a great question. I have to think about the help part. I'll start with the hinder.
Maybe it didn't help.
I think one of the ways it's hindered people of color, especially if we think about the type of organizations that are likely to have remote work at this time, it's one where people of color are underrepresented. Less than, I think, 20% of remote workers identify as Black. in this country. So a lot more of them are overrepresented in the occupations I mentioned before, these essential roles, these healthcare roles. So what happens when you are numerically underrepresented for a company and now isolated through your work from home situation? I think some of the downsides that we will likely see happen is there's lots of network and connection opportunities, where now you have to go through virtual channels to connect with people that you were probably already having difficulty connecting with in the in-person office. And we're also seeing this pressure to present yourself in a way that's professional for Zoom etiquette. And everyone is experiencing this. What happens when I'm looking at myself all day while I'm working? And then there's potential opportunities for micromanagement through the form of video monitoring that has emerged for some employees and workers. I think for people of color, this becomes exacerbated when, like the conversation I was having earlier about my research, notions around professionalism and being engaged at work, all of that can be coded in a very racialized, gendered, and sexualized way. So how a person of color appears professionally may differ than people's expectations of a professional worker. And being able to see ourselves, we now start to question, like, oh, is this the right attire? Is my hair okay? What's happening in the background? Are they seeing artwork that in the US context might look very strange, but in my cultural heritage context, this is totally normal? Our sacred spaces of home have now become opportunities for public gazing, particularly for a public that we put on a work persona too. And now those lines have become blurred. So I certainly think those are the hindrances that's emerged from remote work for people of color. In terms of the various ways it's helped, I see a lot more companies creating accessible ways for people to do their jobs. So this is not, directly associated with people of color, but another marginalized group in the workplace have been people who are differently abled and not having the same access to certain occupations because they weren't able to work from home or have a transcript related video content. And now that's so normalized in our new remote work environment that that's creating more opportunities for them to not only join workplaces, but be engaged and advance and retain these workers into organizations. I guess some of the upsides for people of color is we're also seeing them form different types of connections. I think about rooms like Clubhouse or the various ways that we've seen social media being leveraged lately, where if I'm dealing with an issue inside of my company, I can now easily go to a different platform and either vent or ask for support, which probably would have been difficult if you're at work looking over your shoulder, wondering, is someone watching me go into this chat room complaining about my coworkers or unsure of how to handle a situation. So I think those are some of the upticks that we will likely see for people of color in this remote work environment.
I will say, I was just going to say, to your point about productivity, Yaz and I were discussing how we do feel like both of our jobs are kind of autonomous, but nobody's really keeping a close eye on us. But for some reason, we just feel like we have to show face in order to show that we're being productive, or we have to message a certain amount of times on Slack so people don't think that we're just lounging around. And that definitely is one of the things that has been hurting me. I feel like I'm always on trying to prove myself, especially we're young women too. We're both in our 20s. So we feel like we have something to prove.
Yes, I do think it's interesting the various ways that we can show we are engaged and dedicated to our work now that it's digital. One of my biggest questions that I ask companies when they're trying to figure out how to be inclusive of everyone, I'll say, are videos necessary for meetings? And whatever happened to phone meetings? We used to do this regularly in the pre-COVID era. It takes a lot of attention and energy and mental energy for people to be on camera all day. So to what extent are videos necessary? To what extent are the same work hours and work output necessary during this time? That being said, I do think some people love, the work from home, the flexibility,
Totally.
And not having to perform in other ways that they were performing at work. But the wanting to show that you're active on Slack, that's a really interesting, I think, detriment that people may not be aware of at this time.
What you said actually really dovetails well with something I wanted to bring up. We set ourselves a challenge over the past week that was like personally a disaster for me. And the idea behind it was that we would have our Zoom cameras off for all of our meetings, if possible. So I failed like right out the gate.
It was
like,
hard.
I was like, no, like I need to show people that I'm, that I care. And I'm curious. Well, I guess I have two questions, which is one, do you see different groups or different age, whether it's age groups or in different industries behaving in different ways when it comes to having your camera on or off on Zoom? And then two, something that I've thought a lot about is the fact that when you're not seeing someone's face, like when you're either just talking on the phone or camera off on Zoom, or when you're Slacking, I think tone can get lost a little bit, if that makes sense. Or like, sometimes if I ask a question on Slack, especially, I think it can come off as really pointed when actually like it's like a random question.
This is a great question. I'll start with the communication piece, and then I'll try to share what little I've seen in terms of industry differences. So prior to us having to communicate via Zoom, I think one of the things we took for granted was how much nonverbal goes into communicating. Studies over and over again, when we were doing in-person interaction, show that nonverbal communication is almost 80% of actual speech. It's not the words that we're saying, it's the body language, it's the emotional expression on our faces, it's the use of hands or props. So with the loss of that, or with the narrow dimensions where we now have to present ourselves in these little squares, the consequences that a lot of is getting lost in translation. And we have to over rely on our vocal capacity, the ability to change our tone. And when I'm excited, show you I'm excited, show my teeth. And when I'm upset, try to convey it, eyebrow movement is becoming a new way of showing displeasure, right? And so I think about that for people who English is not the first language for them, or accents are part of their style of speech, all the various ways that Zoom is creating this over-reliance on one form of communication at the expense of others, which I think is a detriment to, advancing opportunities for people and making people feel included at work. In terms of industry differences, I think where we will see major changes are among the companies that were exploring things like a 4-day work week, or having explicit rules that there's no email communication after 5 p.m. or no meeting Fridays. They, I think, are probably more innovative or explicit around the use of cameras for meetings and large lectures. I do think it's not enough to just have a passive thing where, people know they don't have to have their cameras on unless it's something that's explicitly stated. I do think a lot of people will feel pressure. So I'm a faculty member in a school. We have monthly meetings, and whenever the meetings are large, I would say 20 or more people, I certainly do not feel as much pressure to turn my camera on, because I'm thinking, this is a C. They don't need to know that I'm here. But I'm also teaching my undergraduates, and we had a debate among the faculty of should we require that cameras are on? And some of the conversations were, well, what if they're doing other things instead of paying attention to class? And I thought, really skilled computer users can always be doing other things with their camera on. I certainly remember when I was an undergraduate having my Facebook page up right next to my notes. So I don't think there's mutually exclusive, camera use things here. So I decided for my students, and I'll tell you some of the decisions behind it, that they are not required to keep their camera on at all times. But there will be times that I ask them to share their thoughts or, work in breakout rooms. And it would be nice if your fellow students can see you and that we can see and hear from you. So there are some students in my class who keep their cameras on all the time, and there are others who probably never turn theirs on. But there's so many reasons behind why. Their roommate is in the same room as them and they are sleeping, or they have low bandwidth, and if they turn their camera on, they're sacrificing audio, or they're just not feeling it today. We are in the middle of a pandemic. People are dying every day. And they're just not emotionally and mentally prepared for a on-camera performance that things are okay, that it's enough for them to just be in the room and listen to the conversation. And I think that's the more compassionate human approach for me, for the use of cameras in meetings. And I do think the companies that already have some of these rules around boundary enforcement are going to be the ones that also have explicit conversations around camera use.
Yeah. And I like what you said about, our company doesn't necessarily have any set rules. For some reason, I guess I thought it was the professional thing to do to have my camera on when we first started this. Like, I don't know where professionalism came from, but that's just what I thought. And so now our company's having questions about asking questions anonymously and giving anonymous feedback to managers. And some executives are a little opposed to this because that's just their style. They prefer to be open and honest with everybody, have your camera on, show your face. Some people are either shy or maybe they just don't want to show their face. And so I'm curious what you think about, companies giving anonymous feedback or having that kind of anonymity, because as Yaz and I talked about, we like having our camera off because it does give us that anonymity.
Yeah. Ooh, anonymity is such a tricky thing. I think historically, especially thinking about the racial history of this country, we know that anonymity allows opportunity for some of the most extreme and egregious forms of violence and for people to develop mob mentality, right? When they are not individualized, they can join this larger faceless opposition. So inside of companies, anonymous feedback can certainly create opportunities for people to share things that are super irrelevant to the conversation at hand, no consequences for them sharing this information. This is something that emerges in my industry, where in academia, we rely heavily on student evaluations for teachers. And over time, over the past few decades, I would say, the feedback tends to disproportionately there tends to be negative feedback for faculty who are women of all races and faculty who are not US born or English is not their first language. Some of it, very little of it, is also about the actual pedagogy. The feedback that a lot of women faculty receive have to do with their appearance or their tone.
Wow.
Really? I just didn't like them. Oh yeah, there's huge discrepancies in the type and quality of feedback that scholars receive. And it's usually happens that way because it's anonymous, right? It's like when you're anonymous, you can say things that are irrelevant. That being said, inside of companies, the power differences between employees and managers is real. And there might be a lot of consequences for an employee to share what is considered a real concern to their manager without some sort of backlash that could be enacted if the manager is not favorable or if the employee does not feel safe to express certain ideas. And given what we know about the representation of people of color or people from other marginalized groups at work, if you were to share feedback with someone, it's explicitly about race or explicitly about some other form of marginalization, it could be easy to identify who that person is. So my overall recommendation for companies when they want people in power to have feedback is to collect as many forms as possible, to keep it anonymous to some extent, but to also be clear on what is this feedback for, how often are you going to receive it, and what is the follow-up? Is it just giving feedback for feedback's sake? Is there anything that's going to happen post-feedback? And do employees know that they are protected in their feedback giving? And also, is there someone who's actually there to make sure irrelevant feedback is not part of this pile that this related information? I always wondered that with student feedback. It goes through so many hands before it reaches me. And I'm like, how did this comment about what my butt looks like in this dress make it to this final amount of feedback? Like, how is that relevant at all to my pedagogy? And it goes through so many people. So I'm always shocked that they think I need to know this.
Wow. People should just keep their comments to themselves.
Oh yeah. Silence is a missed gift in our society.
Well, recently we actually had a company-wide meeting, and I'm talking like 200 employees on the Zoom call. And I actually was vocal on this call. I had my camera off, but I spoke up, and the conversation was about what I just asked you, giving anonymous feedback. And I spoke up not against one of our executives, but I had an opposing opinion. So I posed my opinion, and I just wanted to know, what you think, our interactions on Zoom, does that kind of give us more comfort? Does that lower inhibition? Because I don't know what got into me.
Yeah. There's very little research on this. So I think a lot of what I'll say will be based off of previous work of people. This isn't the first time that people have worked virtually or telecommuted into work, right? And so drawing from some of that work, the reason why people liked it is because they could feel more comfortable working their own hours that works for their life, but also feeling comfortable and safe in a lot of ways from any potential danger or feelings of discomfort that comes from working alongside people that can like sometimes have opposing views. So I'm starting to collect data on this with Black employees and their virtual engagements. But some of the things that we've seen anecdotally in our data is, asking Black professionals, what are some of the things you like about working from home? And some of the things people said were, I feel comfortable now voicing my opinions, whereas before, sometimes people use their physical stature to intimidate people, stand over someone if they're giving feedback or while they're talking. And that's considered, a way of intimidating and making people silent at work. I'll share my own personal anecdote. People said, what's one of the things you like about working from home? And I said, I don't have to worry about people touching my hair at work. I will walk past certain people, in several jobs in the past. And people would get out of their chair, come out of their office to follow me, reaching, hand outstretched to touch my fro, braids, whatever is in my hair at the time. And I said, it's been so nice to connect with my colleagues for the first time without wondering and worrying, when are they going to try to touch my hair? When am I going to have that awkward conversation that my body is not available for you to touch and have to swat away hands? And then there's also, harassment hasn't gone away, unfortunately, in the workplace. I do think it's evolving in this new virtual environment, but we will probably also see, hopefully, a potential decrease in the type of this physical harassment that people might have been experiencing at work if now they're remote. Unfortunately, that creates opportunities for new forms of harassment. We saw Zoom bombing early on in the pandemic, and I witnessed that before too. We also have people doing very inappropriate things on camera. So there was a whole conversation I remember before we started teaching this school year, and saying things like, should we tell our students that they have to have clothes on when they're on? And I was like, yeah, I get it. We do have to say, because if people are doing this from home, if they're just getting out of bed and they normally, maybe don't have clothes on, maybe it's a good idea for them to put a shirt on at least. But then you have people, I don't even want to repeat what that one guy did. The camera caught him. But that's a form of harassment, right? If you're witnessing that. So I know it's a very long roundabout way to getting to your question. But I do think these are some of the things that we will likely see over time, like what new forms of harassment are emerging, what forms are decreasing, and to what extent do people feel safe now voicing their opinion or wearing their hair in certain styles that, I think about that whenever I get my hair done. Like, I don't know if I want to go to work today. I don't feel like having people, ogle at my braids or try to touch them.
That's interesting. I mean, those are, you mentioned earlier the fact that a lot of people of color have sort of other outlets. So you're seeing like, you could maybe text the group chat or whatever when someone's annoying you. And
I have my little Black group chat, not gonna lie.
I remember when Christina was kind of talking about how much she disagreed with, another employee's position on something. She was like, I'm getting fire emojis on Slack. Like, people are sending me fire emojis and clapping or whatever. And I feel like that's exactly what you were talking about. Like, there's these, it's weird to have like two forms of communication going on at once, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do appreciate knowing now we can more explicitly possibly share when someone is in support of what you're saying. It's always hard sometimes to lock eyes with people across the room. We were in person and it's like, you think this is crazy too, right? Like, okay, okay, I'm not the only one. Like, this is insane what's happening. But But now, how do we do that digitally? So can we send a brief message on the side? Like, oh, yes, I agree. On the other hand, though, I do think we are getting into slacktivism type of support, where sometimes we still need that verbal support. We need for other people outside of our Slack group or outside of this private message to know that you are not the only one that is having this grievance, that they are also in support of this direction or opinion. So how can we create safe channels and opportunities for people to do that? I love the reaction buttons on Zoom. I encourage my students to use them whenever they are in agreement or in a disagreement with someone, so that we can have a conversation about it instead of you just stewing on the side or, typing. I was like, no, let people know when you agree with them. Do the thumbs up or do the thumb, like, no, I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, I like those too.
Sometimes when I'm in a Slack and I see somebody posted something and nobody responded to them, I'll just put a thumbs up just so they know,
totally.
I care.
Different ways we're showing support, right, in groups, and feeling like we have to recognize someone. I think the social media scholars will have lots of opinions on that.
Yeah, it's true. Our last question is really, we're just asking you for advice here. So what advice do you have for us when it comes to kind of interacting with our colleagues or, working remotely? If you're kind of a more early career professional, are there any kind of best practices that, we should and our listeners should keep in mind?
It's a great question. So I initially thought we'd talk about Zoom interviewing, which I think I have so many opinions about. Because I know judgment is real, right? It's like I'm a psychologist and we make snap judgments on people for the smallest tidbit of information, and having a Zoom window, there's so many things that can capture your attention. People are probably wondering, is she Congolese if you recognize that flag? Or, okay, she reads books. If you can see the titles, oh, does she believe in blah? Like there's so many things you could do I have a Harry Potter shirt on. What does that mean? Is she a millennial? Yes, I am. But all these different things that can capture people's attention and make judgments. So I think that's always going to happen. And it shouldn't be on the early career professional to worry about all the things that are going to attract someone's attention, whether you have a Zoom background on or not. There's going to be opportunities for people to make judgments, including things like, well, why do they have a Zoom background on? What's behind them, right? And so that should not be your worry. You do what makes you feel comfortable, work in a setting that makes you feel comfortable. In terms of clothes, because of my research on professionalism, I do think that how people physically show up in these Zoom windows is going to affect not just the person watching you, but also the person wearing the clothes. Mm-hmm. I know for me, whenever I wear a certain lip color or a certain jacket, my mood changes. So if I'm already feeling down or tired, I'll try to put on something bright or warm or something that reminds me of a favorite childhood book, to prepare me for whatever it is I have to do that day. So that would also be part of my advice, is wearing things that match your mood or whatever sort of energy you're trying to capture that day. Also, do speak up, speak often. And when unsure of what to do, ask. Ask, what are the professional norms for this meeting? What are your expectations for us in this meeting? And I think that'll put a lot of, again, a lot of people think passively about the camera situation, like, oh, everyone knows they can just make a choice, but we don't. So It's up to you as the meeting organizer, as the leader, as the manager, to set some norms and also be able to defend those norms. And I think that's the part that a lot of managers are not comfortable with. They'd rather leave it to the atmosphere for other people to decide what they want to do, because they don't have very clear or strong justifications as to why someone should have their camera on or not.
Wow.
But so then I think it's incumbent upon the leaders and the managers to gather whatever data you need to gather to help you make these decisions. Ask your employees how they're doing. Ask them, do they like turning their cameras on? Do pulse, engagement measures throughout the day. Are you seeing people's engagement go up and down whenever they are in camera required meetings versus non-camera required meetings, right? Like how are there different metrics they can use to better inform their meeting norms, I think would be a great use of time as opposed to just watching people do their cameras all day. The last thing I guess I'll say for the early career professionals too is remember that we're living through a pandemic, and this is one that, we've never experienced in our lifetime. Give yourself some grace. Give yourself some,
I love that.
Some compassion. I have laundry on the other chair over there that you can't see, right? I literally pick it up and move it from place to place. And there's nothing wrong with that because this is new for all of us and it's something we want to figure out. And for companies, if they want to retain and help to promote a lot of their early career talent, they have to figure out how to adjust to these current working environments as well. I don't think remote work is going away anytime soon. So I do hope that through conversations like this, through more research, we can develop more inclusive remote work options and ones where people actually enjoy zooming into work.
Definitely.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on.
Yes.
Show yourself some grace to the bosses listening out there.
Like humility goes a long way, honestly.
Show us some grace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yasmin, Christina, thank you so much for having me. This was very fun. And I look forward to listening and continue to listen to your podcast, learn all the ways we can do better at work.
Yes. Thank you so much.